The year is 1962. The world is gripped by tension as the United States and the Soviet Union stand on the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has ever come to World War III. But how did we get here, and why was this event so crucial in the Cold War?
The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962.
To understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, we need to go back to the Cold War, the ideological battle between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. Both sides were in an arms race, developing nuclear weapons to gain an advantage. In 1959, a revolution in Cuba brought Fidel Castro to power. He was a communist, and his new government quickly became allies of the Soviet Union. This was a huge problem for the USA. Cuba was just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. When the US failed to overthrow Castro in the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, the Cuba turned to the Soviets for protection. In October 1962, American spy planes flying over Cuba took shocking photographs. Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed on the island. These missiles could reach US cities in minutes, making a Soviet nuclear attack much more dangerous.
Here, for example, is a medium-range ballistic missile base that has been labeled by these specialists. Suddenly, the veil is torn from the Russian secrets. Another photo revealed a surface-to-air missile assembly depot, a base to supply the offensive sites. Russian technicians ripped through heavy jungle growth to carve out airstrips for high-performance MiG-21 jets, a plane easily capable of strikes far into the United States.
President John F. Kennedy had to act fast. He gathered his top advisors in what became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, otherwise known as EXCOM. The world watched as tensions rose to dangerous levels. Instead of attacking Cuba, which could have started World War III, Kennedy decided on a naval blockade. This meant US warships would stop and inspect any Soviet ships heading to Cuba, preventing more missiles from arriving. The world held its breath. On October 24, 1962, Soviet ships approached the blockade. Would they stop, or would they break through, triggering a war? At the last moment, the Soviet ships turned around, but the crisis wasn't over yet. Behind the scenes, tense negotiations were happening between the US and Soviet leaders.
They retreat to Moscow. Russian ships steam out from Cuban ports with their decks loaded with missiles the Soviets are withdrawing under pressure from the New World. It's one of the last chapters in the offensive threat from Cuba that led the United States to throw a quarantine around that island and force the Russians to dismantle their medium-range rocket installations. U.S. planes and picket ships have counted 42 rockets on Russian-bound ships, but still unresolved is...
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in the Cold War. For one, it was the closest the world came to a nuclear war. Just one wrong move could have led to global disaster. Second reason why was that it led to a better communication. A direct hotline between Washington and Moscow was set up to help the leaders talk quickly in the future crises. For a third reason, it encouraged arms control. Both sides realized the danger of nuclear weapons and later signed treaties to limit their use. And the last reason was, it showed the importance of diplomacy. Instead of war, the crisis was solved through negotiation, a lesson that would shape the future of Cold War events. The Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the most dangerous moments in human history. It showed how fragile peace can be and how important diplomacy is in avoiding war. The world was lucky to escape the disaster in 1962, but the threat of nuclear war remained for the rest of the Cold War. Would world war leaders handle such a crisis as well as today? That's a question for